A millionaire opens the back door of his car and finds a little girl asleep inside, then she whispers, "I'm sorry. I was just cold." Snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes that glimmered beneath the yellow streetlights, coating the silent city in a brittle kind of beauty. It was nearly midnight, the kind of cold that made the air sharp enough to hurt when you breathed. Alex Hunter walked briskly across the nearly empty parking lot, his breath forming pale clouds in the air. He had just left a dinner meeting that had dragged on for hours, full of meaningless conversation and fake laughter. His driver had taken the night off. Alex preferred solitude after days like this, and he was ready to shut out the world behind the tinted windows of his luxury sedan. He unlocked the car, the sound of the doors clicking open echoing faintly in the cold. When he pulled on the handle of the back door to toss in his briefcase, the last thing he expected to see was someone inside. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The city was full of shadows at this hour, reflections and shapes that didn't belong. But then he saw her, small, fragile, curled up on the leather seat like a lost bird. A girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with tangled curls of pale blonde hair that framed a face too delicate for the world she'd clearly been surviving in. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly blue, and her little white dress, completely inadequate for the freezing weather, was smudged with dirt. She was hugging a battered doll to her chest, her tiny shoulders trembling. For a moment, Alex simply froze, the keys slipping from his hand and clattering to the pavement. His first thought was that someone must have broken into his car, but how could a child have done that? He glanced around the parking lot, half expecting someone to appear, an angry parent, a thief, a desperate stranger, but there was no one. The streets were empty. Only the sound of the wind moving through the bare branches filled the air. His heart began to pound. Slowly, he crouched beside the open door, unsure if he should wake her. Before he could speak, the girl stirred, blinking drowsily. Her eyes were an impossible shade of blue, startlingly clear even in the dim light. She looked up at him, frightened but too tired to move. When she spoke, her voice was small and trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her breath fogging the air. "I just wanted to sit here for a little. I was cold." The simplicity of the words hit him like a punch. It wasn't fear in her tone, it was exhaustion, the kind that no child should ever know. Alex's first instinct was to demand how she got in, to call someone, anyone. But as he looked at her bare arms, her chapped hands, her doll clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white, he realized she wasn't a problem to solve. She was a child who had run out of places to go. He shrugged off his expensive wool coat and draped it around her shoulders before he even knew what he was doing. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of his coat, as though afraid it might be taken away. "Sophie," she said after a moment. "Where are your parents, Sophie?" he asked, his voice soft but strained. She looked down, tracing the seam of the seat with one small finger. "Mommy went to sleep in the sky," she murmured. "Daddy said he'd come back for me, but he didn't." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Alex stared at her, feeling a hollow ache open in his chest. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He had been around tragedy before, he'd seen it in the newspapers, in the faces of people he'd fired, in his own reflection, but never like this, never in the eyes of someone so young. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice rougher now. Sophie shrugged weakly. "I don't know. It's been dark a long time." The answer made his stomach twist. He looked at her small feet, covered in thin shoes soaked through with melted snow. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. "Hey," he said after a long silence, trying to sound steady even as his thoughts raced. "You can't stay out here, okay? It's too cold." She blinked up at him, wide-eyed. "I wasn't hurting anything," she said softly. "I just wanted to sit where it was warm. You have nice seats." A faint, heartbreaking smile touched her lips, as if she expected him to scold her but wanted to soften it. I'm not mad, Alex said, shaking his head. You just surprised me, that's all. She hesitated before nodding, her shoulders sinking in relief. He helped her sit up properly and adjusted the coat around her. The car's heater was still running faintly from earlier, and when he closed the door and started the engine again, the warm air began to fill the space. Sophie leaned her head back against the seat, her eyelids heavy. You can rest for a bit, he said, unsure of why he was saying it. I'll take you somewhere safe. Her voice was barely a whisper when she replied. I don't want to go anywhere else. I just want to be warm. Something inside him broke then, something that had been frozen for years. He sat there, staring out the windshield at the falling snow, his mind replaying her words over and over. He knew what he should do, call the authorities, take her to the nearest shelter, but the thought of handing her over to someone else, of watching her vanish back into the cold, filled him with dread. He turned slightly, looking at her again. She was already asleep, her face peaceful now beneath the shadow of his coat. Alex leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. He had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, keeping the world at a safe distance, building walls no one could climb. But in one impossible moment, a stranger had slipped through all of them. The man who had spent a decade avoiding every sign of weakness now found himself sitting in a parked car, watching over a lost child who had stolen his composure with a single, trembling sentence. He reached out and carefully adjusted the coat so it covered her completely, then turned the heat up another notch. It's okay, Sophie, he said quietly, though she was already asleep. You can stay warm here for as long as you need. He didn't know what the next hour would bring, what he would say if someone came looking for her, or how this one act of mercy would change everything. All he knew was that for the first time in years, his car didn't feel empty, and neither did he. The snow kept falling outside, silent and endless, and somewhere in that quiet, something inside Alex Hunter began to thaw. The following morning arrived with the kind of dull gray light that always came after a snowstorm. Alex had barely slept. He had sat in the armchair across from the fireplace most of the night, watching the flames flicker and listening to the soft, steady breathing of the little girl sleeping on the couch. The mansion was silent except for the occasional crackle of burning wood and the distant hum of the city that lay far below the hill where he lived. It was the first time in years that the quiet had felt different, not peaceful, not comfortable, but fragile, as though the smallest sound could shatter it. Sophie had fallen asleep as soon as she stepped inside, still wrapped in his oversized coat, her small hands clinging to the edge of it like it was the last bit of safety she had in the world. He had carried her into the house carefully, afraid of waking her, and set her on the couch near the fireplace. Then he'd stood there for what felt like hours, unsure what to do next. There was a time when he had been able to make decisions in seconds, business deals worth millions, mergers that changed markets, but now, faced with a sleeping child who had nowhere to go, he felt helpless. He made a few calls, left messages with the local authorities, and searched online for missing child reports, but nothing seemed to match. He wasn't surprised. The world was full of people who disappeared quietly, without anyone to notice. When the first light of morning broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sophie stirred. She rubbed her eyes, blinking against the light, and for a moment, she looked frightened, like she didn't know where she was. Alex set down his coffee and crouched beside the couch. It's okay, he said quietly. You're safe here. She looked at him, her expression uncertain. Then she nodded, slowly, and sank back into the pillows. He noticed how small she was compared to the couch, how her feet didn't even reach the edge of the blanket. Are you hungry? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded again. In the kitchen, he found himself opening cabinets and drawers, realizing he had no idea what children ate for breakfast. His pantry was full of expensive things he never touched, imported coffee, wine, protein bars, bottles of mineral water. Nothing that looked remotely comforting. After several minutes of hesitation, he cracked a few eggs and made scrambled eggs, slightly burned around the edges, and poured a glass of orange juice. When he placed the plate in front of her, she looked at it as if she couldn't believe it was for her. "You can eat," he said with a small shrug. "It's not poisoned." She giggled softly at that, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh. It was a quiet sound, uncertain but full of life, and it stirred something in him that he didn't realize he'd been missing. As she ate, he sat across from her, trying not to stare. There was something about the way she ate, slowly, carefully, as if afraid someone would take the food away, that made him ache. "How long were you outside, Sophie?" he asked gently. She stopped chewing, her fork hovering in the air. "I don't know," she said finally. "A long time. I used to stay with some people after Daddy left, but they didn't want me anymore. I think I did something bad." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Alex felt a sharp pain in his chest. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his tone. "You were just cold, that's all." She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time he saw a flicker of trust. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy quiet. Alex called social services again, but the office line went unanswered, and he wasn't sure if he was relieved or frustrated. He had always believed in order and systems, in following the right process. But now, faced with bureaucracy that moved at the pace of apathy, he realized how easily people slipped through the cracks. He looked over at Sophie, who was sitting on the floor near the fireplace, drawing on a piece of paper he had found in his office. She was humming softly, a tune that sounded both cheerful and heartbreaking. He didn't know the song, but it carried a sadness that felt too deep for someone so young. When she finished, she held up the paper for him to see. It was a crude drawing of two figures, one tall, one small, standing under what looked like a big house with smoke rising from the chimney. "That's you," she said, pointing at the taller one. "And that's me. And that's your house. It's warm here." He stared at the picture, unable to speak. It was simple, childish, but it felt like something sacred. He took the drawing from her carefully, as though it might crumble in his hands. "That's nice," he said, his voice low. "Do you draw a lot?" She nodded proudly. "Daddy used to say I was good at it. He said maybe one day I could draw big houses like the ones he built." Alex frowned. "Your dad built houses?" "Aha. He said one day we'd have one of our own. But then." She trailed off, her voice fading. "Then he had to go drive again. He said he'd come back before it got cold." Alex looked away, his throat tightening. He knew that promise too well, the kind made with love but broken by circumstance. He had made similar promises once, to people who had believed in him, and he had failed them too. Sophie yawned, rubbing her eyes again, and he realized she still looked exhausted. "You can rest if you want," he said quietly. "There's a guest room upstairs." She hesitated, glancing toward the window. "You won't send me away?" she asked in a small voice. The question cut deeper than he expected. "No," he said after a pause. "Not right now." She nodded, satisfied, and climbed the stairs slowly, dragging his oversized coat behind her like a blanket. When she disappeared from view, Alex leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The room felt different now, filled with traces of her, her tiny footprints on the marble floor, her soft humming echoing faintly upstairs. For years, his house had been a mausoleum for memories he refused to face. But now, for the first time, it felt alive again. He stared at the drawing still resting on the table, the stick figure smiling beneath a crooked roof, and thought of how fragile it all was, how easily a single night could change everything. Outside, the snow began to fall again, silent and steady, and Alex realized he didn't want this feeling to fade. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew, deep down, that Sophie's presence had opened something in him he had kept buried for far too long. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let her face the cold alone ever again. The following days blurred together in a way Alex hadn't experienced in years. His life had always been defined by order, schedules, and precision, meetings that began on the minute, deals that closed exactly as predicted, a world so tightly controlled that there was no space for unpredictability. But now, his days began not with phone calls or reports, but with the quiet sound of small footsteps on the marble floor, the faint smell of toast burning in the kitchen, and the sound of laughter echoing through a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Sophie had a way of filling silence without speaking much. She moved through the house as if exploring an entirely new world, touching everything with the cautious wonder of someone who had never had anything of her own. Every now and then, Alex caught himself smiling at her curiosity, and the realization unsettled him. It had been a long time since he had smiled without thinking. He tried to go about his work as usual, but it proved impossible. The calls he made to his office were brief and distracted, his mind always halfway elsewhere. His assistant noticed immediately. "You sound different, Mr. Hunter," she said on the phone one morning, her tone cautious. "Is everything all right?" He wanted to say yes, but the truth was more complicated. How could he explain that he had brought a lost child into his home and that she had somehow cracked the armor he had built around himself? "Just tired," he said shortly, ending the call before she could press further. He wasn't ready to share this part of his life with anyone. He wasn't even sure what this part was yet. That afternoon, he found Sophie sitting by the window, staring at the city far below. The snow was beginning to melt, and the rooftops glistened under a pale winter sun. "Do you like it here?" he asked, stepping closer. She turned to look at him and nodded. "It's high," she said softly. "You can see everything. It looks like the clouds are close." He followed her gaze, realizing he had never really noticed the view before, despite living there for years. It was beautiful in a distant kind of way, like looking at the world from behind glass. Sophie's words reminded him of something his son used to say, long ago, before the accident. He pushed the thought away, but it lingered, heavy and unwelcome. "Do you ever go up there?" Sophie asked suddenly, pointing toward the sky. "Up where?" he asked, confused. "Up where the planes go. Mommy used to say that's where heaven starts." The innocence in her voice hit him hard. He cleared his throat, searching for an answer. "No," he said finally. "I don't go up there." She tilted her head, studying him as if trying to understand why. "Are you scared?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe," he admitted. "But not of heights." She seemed to accept that, turning back to the window. "Mommy said when people go to sleep in the sky, they still watch you. Even if you can't see them." Her words hung in the air, soft and certain, and for a moment Alex couldn't breathe. Later that evening, while she was drawing in the living room, Alex sat at his desk, staring at an old photograph on the corner of it. His wife, Lily, and their little boy, Ben, smiling on a beach that no longer existed in his memory without pain. The photo had been turned face down for years, but Sophie had found it while exploring and placed it upright again, as if restoring something sacred. He should have felt angry or exposed, but instead he just felt seen. It was as though she had found the one part of him he had spent years burying and quietly brought it back into the light. He closed his eyes, remembering the day of the crash, the phone call, the sirens, the unbearable quiet afterward. He remembered the guilt, the way it consumed him, how he buried himself in work because it was the only thing he could still control. He had vowed never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. But now, without warning, a small girl had walked into his life and done exactly that, not with pain but with something far more dangerous, hope. That night, he tucked her into the guest bed. It had been decades since he had done such a thing. She looked impossibly small under the blanket, her blonde curls spilling over the pillow. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then nodded, sitting in the chair beside her bed. She held the teddy bear he had bought for her that afternoon, the one she had chosen with shy excitement in the toy store. You know, she said sleepily, my daddy used to sit like this. He said monsters don't come when someone's watching. Alex smiled faintly. He was right, he said. They don't. Her eyes fluttered shut, her breathing evening out, and within minutes she was asleep. He stayed long after she drifted off, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, the way her hand curled around the bear. In that quiet room, he felt something shift inside him, something both terrifying and tender. He realized, with a pang of clarity, that he had stopped thinking of her as a stranger. Somewhere between the late-night rescue and the morning laughter, she had become something else. He didn't know what word to use, responsibility, connection, maybe even family, but whatever it was, it felt real. The following morning, he woke to find her already in the kitchen, perched on a stool with a glass of milk and a slice of toast she had managed to make herself. The sight made him smile despite himself. You're up early, he said. I didn't want to bother you, she replied seriously. You looked tired. He chuckled softly. You don't have to worry about me, Sophie. I think you do, she said simply, her tone so earnest that he couldn't find an answer. After breakfast, she wandered into his study while he was reading emails. Can I sit here? She asked, pointing at the chair across from him. Of course. She climbed up and watched him type for a while. You have a lot of words on your screen, she said. What do they mean? They're about work, he explained. I build things. Like my daddy, she said with a small smile. He said building things means you make homes for people. Do you make homes too? The question stopped him cold. He thought of the skyscrapers and office towers his company had built, cold, efficient monuments to ambition. None of them were homes. Not really, he admitted. Maybe I should. She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding something important. You already did, she said finally, pointing toward her heart. You gave me one. He didn't know what to say. Words felt useless in that moment. He reached across the desk and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. You're something else, you know that. She grinned. Mommy used to say that too. Then she hopped off the chair and ran off, leaving him alone with the warmth of her words lingering like sunlight in the coldest part of his soul. When the house finally grew quiet again, Alex sat there for a long time, staring out the window, watching the last of the snow melt into water. For years, he had believed that loss was permanent, that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. But now, as he listened to the faint sound of Sophie humming down the hall, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. Maybe, just maybe, some hearts could be rebuilt, even his. The next morning began with a quiet that didn't feel like silence but more like anticipation. Alex woke earlier than usual, before the sun had fully climbed over the city skyline. For a long while, he lay in bed, listening to the faint noises drifting through the mansion, soft footsteps, the clink of dishes, the humming of a small voice somewhere in the distance. He didn't recognize the tune, but it had that same fragile sweetness that Sophie always carried with her, something that made the emptiness of the house feel less suffocating. When he finally came downstairs, he found her in the kitchen, standing on her tiptoes as she tried to reach the counter. She was wearing one of his shirts as a kind of makeshift robe, the sleeves trailing on the floor, and she was carefully arranging slices of bread on a plate. She turned when she heard him and gave a shy smile. I tried to make breakfast, she said, her voice full of pride and apology at the same time. But the toaster scared me. He laughed softly, a sound that startled even him. That's all right. It scares me sometimes too. He moved closer and took the plate from her, setting it on the counter. There was something oddly grounding about her presence in his house, something that made the air feel real again. For so many years, he had lived surrounded by silence, expensive silence, the kind that came with high ceilings and marble floors and too much space. But now that quiet had been broken by laughter, by questions, by the kind of sound that reminded him he wasn't alone. He hadn't realized how heavy loneliness had become until it started to lift. After breakfast, he decided to take her outside. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of grass peeking through the ice. He watched as Sophie darted ahead of him down the driveway, her curls bouncing, her breath visible in the crisp air. She twirled once, the oversized coat he had given her flaring out around her, and laughed, a sound so full of life that it echoed in the stillness. "It's not so cold anymore," she said, holding out her hands as if to feel the sun. "It's still winter," he reminded her. "But not forever," she said, turning to look at him with a smile that made his chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. They walked along the edge of the property, past the tall iron gates and down toward the small park beyond the hill. He hadn't been there in years. It used to be a place where he took his son on weekends, before everything changed. The memories came back like ghosts, soft laughter, the smell of coffee from the small kiosk, the way his wife's hand had felt in his. Sophie didn't notice his silence. She ran ahead, her shoes crunching through the slush, stopping only when she reached the frozen pond at the edge of the park. "Can I go on it?" she asked eagerly. "No," he said quickly, too sharply. "It's not safe." She blinked, startled by his tone, and he immediately regretted it. "I just don't want you to get hurt," he said more softly. "Okay." She nodded, her smile returning after a moment. "You sound like my daddy," she said, turning back to the pond. "He used to say that too." Something inside him tightened. He wanted to ask about her father but stopped himself. Every time she mentioned him, her eyes changed, filled with a kind of quiet sadness that was almost too much to witness. Instead, he just watched her, feeling something unfamiliar twist inside him. He had spent a decade building walls so nothing could reach him again, but somehow this small child had walked right through them without even trying. He wasn't sure when she had become so important to him, only that the thought of losing her now made him feel something dangerously close to fear. That night, after dinner, he sat in his office going through emails when he heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he said, expecting one of the staff. Instead, Sophie appeared, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. "Can I stay here for a little?" she asked. "It's too quiet upstairs." He nodded toward the armchair near the window. "Of course." She climbed up, her legs dangling, and watched him work. After a few minutes, she asked, "Why do you have so many papers?" He smiled faintly. "Because I make things complicated." "You don't have to," she said simply. "You could just build something pretty." He looked at her, her words so innocent and yet so devastatingly true that he didn't know how to respond. He had built an empire out of glass and steel, but not once had he built something that made anyone happy. Later, when she fell asleep in the chair, he closed his laptop and just sat there, looking at her. The city lights flickered against the window, casting soft reflections across the room. He thought about how strange it was that she trusted him so completely. A few days ago, she had been a stranger shivering in the cold, and now she slept in his office as though she belonged there. That realization frightened him more than he wanted to admit, because he knew what it meant. He was beginning to care about her. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't wanted it, but there it was, undeniable and absolute. He carried her upstairs, her head resting against his shoulder, and tucked her into bed. For a long time, he stood there watching her sleep, the faint rhythm of her breathing the only sound in the room. He wondered how a child who had lost everything could still trust so easily. He wondered when he had stopped believing in that kind of innocence. When he finally turned to leave, she murmured in her sleep, "Don't go too far, Daddy." The word hit him like a blade and a blessing all at once. He froze, his hand on the doorknob, his chest tightening painfully. For a long moment, he couldn't move. Then, quietly, he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." Downstairs, he poured himself a drink he didn't touch. He sat in the dim light, the word echoing in his mind over and over. "Daddy." It had been years since anyone had called him that. The sound of it reopened something he thought had died the day his family did. He knew Sophie wasn't his daughter, knew she was just a lost child who had stumbled into his life, but the way she said it, the absolute faith in her voice, made him want to be that person again, the man he had been before the world fell apart. He stared into the fire, realizing that she had done something no one else could. She had made him remember what it felt like to care, to protect, to love. It terrified him, but it also made him feel alive for the first time in years. And as the firelight flickered across the room, he understood one thing with startling clarity: whatever came next, he couldn't let her slip away. The following week brought a shift that Alex hadn't been prepared for. The small, quiet world he had built around himself began to crack open as Sophie became a part of his everyday life. What had started as an unexpected intrusion was now something deeper, something he couldn't define or escape from. His mansion no longer felt like a cold monument to success, it had become a home filled with footsteps, laughter, and the faint sound of her voice singing off-key while she played with her toys in the living room. He found himself waking up earlier than usual just to see her at breakfast, watching the way she swung her legs under the table as she talked about the most ordinary things with extraordinary enthusiasm. The once sterile halls now carried warmth, and Alex realized he was beginning to depend on it. But with warmth came the weight of fear. He knew this couldn't last forever. Every night when Sophie fell asleep, he found himself standing in the doorway of her room, watching her breathe, feeling the same tightness in his chest that came with knowing she wasn't his to keep. He had made several calls to social services over the past few days, but every time the line connected, he found a reason to hang up before saying her name. A part of him knew he was doing the wrong thing, he wasn't her father, and she deserved a real family, but another part of him couldn't bear the thought of strangers taking her away. She had been alone for too long, and so had he. One afternoon, while he was reviewing paperwork in his office, the doorbell rang. He froze. The housekeeper answered, and a moment later, she appeared in his doorway looking uneasy. "There's a woman here from social services," she said. Alex felt the words like ice in his veins. He stood slowly, forcing his expression to stay calm. "Show her in." A middle-aged woman stepped into the room, her smile polite but professional. "Mr. Hunter, my name is Karen Myers. We received a report about a missing child who may be in your care." He gestured for her to sit, though his heart was hammering. "Yes," he said carefully. "Sophie. I found her sleeping in my car a week ago. I called several times, but I never heard back." She nodded. "We've been overwhelmed lately, but I'm glad she's safe. May I speak with her?" He hesitated, then called softly for Sophie. She appeared a moment later, holding her teddy bear, her expression wary as she saw the stranger. "Hi, sweetheart," the woman said kindly. "My name's Karen. Can we talk for a minute?" Sophie moved closer to Alex, gripping his sleeve. "Are you gonna take me away?" she asked quietly. Karen blinked, glancing at Alex before answering. "We just need to make sure you're all right, honey." But Sophie didn't let go. "I don't want to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex crouched down to her level, his throat tight. "It's okay," he said softly. "She just wants to help." Sophie shook her head. "I don't need help. I have you." The simplicity of her words broke something in him, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Karen gave him a look, sympathetic, but firm. "Mr. Hunter, this is temporary. We have to follow procedure. We'll place her in a foster home until we can review her case." Alex straightened, his jaw tightening. "She's been through enough," he said quietly. "You take her now, you'll destroy her." Karen sighed. "I understand how you feel, but the system failed her," he interrupted. "You lost her once already." His tone was sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. Sophie clung to him, tears streaming down her face, and that was enough to make his decision for him. "Please," he said finally, his voice breaking for the first time in years. Just give me some time. The woman hesitated, studying him for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll give you a week. But I need to report back. After that, I'll have to act. When she left, the silence in the house felt heavier than it had in years. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. You don't want me anymore? She asked. The question hit him like a physical blow. He knelt and took her by the shoulders. That's not it, he said firmly. I want you to stay. More than anything. But sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't want to do. Then don't, she said simply. Just don't. He smiled weakly, brushing a tear from her cheek. You make it sound easy. It is easy, she whispered. You just keep me. Her innocence was devastating, and he found himself wishing the world worked the way she saw it. That night, after she fell asleep, he sat by the fire, a drink untouched in his hand, thinking about what he had said to the social worker. He knew he had crossed a line, but he didn't regret it. For the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. He remembered the day his wife and son had died, the way the police officer had looked at him with pity, the way they had said there was nothing he could have done. He had believed them then. But now, looking at Sophie, he knew that was no longer true. This time, he could do something. He could protect her. The next morning, he called his lawyer. I want to start guardianship proceedings, he said without hesitation. There's a girl, Sophie. She needs someone. His lawyer was quiet for a moment. That's a serious step, Alex, he said finally. You'll be fighting the state. I don't care, Alex said. She's worth it. The words surprised him even as he said them, but they felt right. Over the next few days, he gathered everything he could, documents, background checks, letters of recommendation. His staff didn't understand what had changed in him, but they saw the difference. He was alive again, driven not by ambition but by something far more human. Sophie didn't know what was happening exactly, but she could feel the tension. One evening, as he was sitting at his desk surrounded by paperwork, she came in and climbed onto his lap without saying a word. He put down his pen and wrapped an arm around her. You're working too much, she said with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. You'll get tired. He smiled. Maybe. But some things are worth it. She tilted her head. Like me? He nodded. Especially you. She rested her head against his chest, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. When she finally fell asleep in his arms, he looked down at her and realized how much she had changed him. A week ago, he wouldn't have believed this version of himself could exist, the man who sat awake at night not worrying about profits but about keeping a promise. The man who had found meaning not in success but in the simple act of caring for someone else. The fear of losing her was still there, sharp and constant, but now it came with something else, determination. He wasn't going to let the system, or anyone else, take away the only light that had managed to break through his darkness. For the first time in years, Alex Hunter was willing to fight not for power or redemption, but for love. The week that followed was one of the longest of Alex Hunter's life. He woke up each day with a strange sense of dread, knowing that every minute counted, that at any moment the social worker might return to take Sophie away. He had been in negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, he had faced ruthless competitors and political pressure, but nothing had ever made him feel this helpless. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work, couldn't think about anything except the little girl who had somehow become the center of his world. Every time he saw her laughing in the hallway, every time she ran into his office with a new drawing in her hand, a part of him broke at the thought that it could all disappear in an instant. He spent the days on the phone with his lawyer, gathering documents, verifying background checks, and answering questions he had never imagined anyone would ask him. Are you prepared for the emotional responsibility, Mr. Hunter? Can you provide a stable home environment? Do you understand the implications of guardianship? The question seemed absurd to him. He had built skyscrapers, managed thousands of employees, and survived the public scrutiny of a world that chewed people up for less. But now, he was being asked to prove that he was capable of loving a child. For the first time, he understood that all his money, all his power, meant nothing here. Sophie, of course, didn't know any of this. She could sense that something was wrong, but she didn't ask. Instead, she stayed close to him, as if she could feel that he needed her as much as she needed him. Sometimes she would sit quietly in his office while he worked, sketching pictures on scraps of paper. One afternoon, she drew a picture of a man and a girl holding hands under a huge sun, and she carefully wrote their names beneath it, Alex and Sophie. When she handed it to him, her face serious and proud, he didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded and placed it on his desk beside the photo of his wife and son, where it remained ever since. The days passed quickly, and with each one, his anxiety grew. On the 6th day, he received a call from Karen Myers. Her voice was calm but formal. "Mr. Hunter, I'll be stopping by tomorrow to finalize our report. Please understand that unless there are extraordinary circumstances, Sophie will have to be placed in temporary foster care while we review your petition." He thanked her politely, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for a long time. His hands trembled slightly, something that hadn't happened since the day he buried his family. For a moment, he thought about giving up, letting the system take its course, convincing himself it was what was best for her. But then he remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "You don't want me anymore," and the thought made him feel sick. He couldn't let her go. Not again. Not when he finally had a chance to make something right. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Sophie came into his study wearing her pajamas and holding her teddy bear. "You're sad," she said simply, climbing onto the couch beside him. He smiled faintly. "Maybe just tired." "You work too much," she said. "You should rest." He laughed quietly, running a hand through his hair. "You sound like my assistant." "Then she's smart," Sophie said matter-of-factly, resting her head on his arm. They sat together for a while, watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. "Are you scared?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, surprised. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you look like it," she said. "Like you're afraid someone's going to take your favorite thing." His throat tightened. "Maybe I am," he admitted quietly. She turned to face him, her small hand resting on his arm. "Then hold on tight," she whispered. "Don't let go." The next morning came too soon. He woke to the sound of footsteps and voices downstairs. Karen had arrived early. He dressed quickly and found her in the living room, clipboard in hand, her expression neutral but kind. Sophie stood nearby, clutching her bear, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "Good morning, Mr. Hunter," Karen said. "I'll need to speak with Sophie privately for a few minutes." "Of course," he said, forcing himself to smile. As he turned to leave, Sophie reached for his hand. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'll be right outside." He waited in the hallway, pacing, listening to the muffled voices from inside the room. He could only make out fragments, Karen's gentle questions, Sophie's small, trembling answers. When they finally emerged, Karen's expression was unreadable. She thanked him for his cooperation and said she would contact him once the final report was submitted. "How long will that take?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "A few weeks, perhaps," she replied. "In the meantime, Sophie will be placed in temporary care." He felt the floor tilt beneath him. "No," he said, the word slipping out before he could stop it. "Please." "Not yet." Karen hesitated. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hunter. I don't have a choice." Sophie stood silently between them, clutching her teddy bear, tears welling in her eyes. "You said I could stay," she whispered. Her voice broke on the last word, and Alex felt something inside him collapse. He knelt in front of her, his hands shaking. I meant it, he said, his voice raw. I'm going to fix this, I promise. I'll find a way. She looked at him for a long moment, then threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. Please don't let them take me, she cried. He hugged her back, his eyes burning, and whispered the only thing he could think of. I won't. I swear I won't. When the social worker finally led her away, Alex stood at the door, unable to move. He watched as the car drove down the long, snow-covered driveway until it disappeared from view. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence it had been before. It was heavier now, sharper, full of echoes. He walked back into the living room, her drawings still scattered across the table, her small shoes by the couch where she'd left them. He picked up one of her pictures, the one of the two of them holding hands, and sat down on the floor, staring at it until the lines blurred. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Hours, maybe. At some point, his phone rang, but he ignored it. All he could think about was the promise he had made and the hollow ache in his chest where her laughter used to be. He had lost everything once before, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't fate or tragedy, it was choice, and he refused to accept it. As night fell, he stood, straightened his tie, and walked into his office. He called his lawyer again. We're not waiting for the system, he said flatly. We're fighting it. His lawyer sighed. Alex, this won't be easy. It never is, Alex replied. But she's my daughter now, whether the world agrees or not. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, blanketing the city in white. Somewhere out there, Sophie was sleeping in a strange bed, clutching her bear, believing in his promise. And Alex, for the first time in years, had something to fight for that truly mattered. The first hearing took place 2 weeks later, in a courthouse that smelled faintly of old paper and rain-soaked coats. Alex sat at the long wooden table, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw set in that familiar expression he used in business meetings when everything was on the line. But this time, it wasn't a merger or a deal, it was Sophie. He had never felt so unprepared in his life. Across the room sat a representative from social services and a guardian ad litem, both calm and detached, as if this were just another case. To them, maybe it was. But to him, it was everything. When the judge entered, everyone stood, and Alex's heart began to pound in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but today, that was exactly what he was. His lawyer spoke first, presenting the petition for guardianship and highlighting Alex's record, his financial stability, his reputation, the absence of any criminal or psychological concerns. It was all logical, factual, clean. But Alex knew that what really mattered wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the quiet moments he couldn't explain, the sound of Sophie's laughter echoing through the hallways, the way she clung to him when she was scared, the small drawings she made of the two of them together. None of that could fit into a legal brief. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, straightening his tie as he faced the judge. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but low, I understand the law has rules, and I respect them. But this isn't about rules. It's about a child who was left behind and a chance to give her a home. I didn't look for her. She found me. And I can't walk away from that. For a long moment, there was silence. The judge regarded him thoughtfully, then turned to the representative from Social Services. Ms. Myers, what is your recommendation? Karen looked conflicted. She had seen Sophie with Alex more than once over the past few weeks. She had seen how the girl's eyes lit up when she talked about him, how she ran to him without hesitation. But she was bound by duty, and duty didn't allow for sentiment. Your Honor, she said carefully, Mr. Hunter's intentions are commendable. However, the child's well-being requires a proper evaluation period. We recommend continued foster care until a final decision can be made. The words were clinical, but Alex heard them like a death sentence. When the session ended, the judge ordered an extension, a further investigation, a home assessment, psychological evaluations. It was better than an outright denial, but it meant more waiting, more distance. As Alex stepped outside into the cold air, the snow had begun again, thin flakes that melted the moment they touched his coat. He stood on the courthouse steps for a long time, staring at the traffic below, the people rushing by with umbrellas and briefcases, their lives moving forward while his head frozen around one small girl. His lawyer joined him a moment later. "It's not over," he said. "We can build a stronger case. You just have to be patient." Alex nodded numbly. "She doesn't have time for patience," he murmured. "She's a child. She needs someone now." Over the next few weeks, he devoted himself entirely to the case. He canceled business meetings, ignored investors, and poured his resources into gathering every document, every witness, every possible argument that could prove he was capable of raising her. He even hired a child psychologist, Dr. Williams, to evaluate the bond between him and Sophie. The first meeting with the doctor took place at a neutral location, a small playroom filled with soft colors and toys. Sophie was sitting at a table drawing when Alex arrived. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw him, that wide, unguarded smile that still startled him with how genuine it was. "You came," she said softly, and he felt the knot in his chest loosen just a little. Dr. Williams observed quietly as they interacted. "Tell me, Sophie," she said gently, "what do you like about Mr. Hunter?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "He makes the house warm," she said. "He listens when I talk. He doesn't get mad when I draw on his papers. And he said I could stay as long as I want." The doctor smiled. "And how do you feel when you're with him?" Sophie paused, thinking hard, then said, "Safe. Like when Daddy used to hold my hand." The simplicity of her answer made Alex turn away for a moment, pretending to check his phone just so she wouldn't see the emotion in his face. When the session ended, Dr. Williams took him aside. "She trusts you completely," she said. "That kind of bond doesn't happen by accident." "Then tell them that," he replied, his voice sharp with desperation. "Tell the court." She nodded slowly. "I will." The next hearing came sooner than expected. This time, Sophie was allowed to attend, though she stayed in the back with a social worker. When she saw Alex, she waved shyly. He smiled, trying to project calm, but inside he was shaking. The courtroom felt smaller this time, the air heavier. The judge began with formalities, then turned to Dr. Williams for her report. "Based on my observation," she said clearly, "the emotional attachment between Mr. Hunter and the child is strong, mutual, and beneficial. Removing her again would likely cause psychological harm." The judge nodded slowly, taking notes. "Thank you, doctor." When it was his turn to speak, Alex didn't read from the notes his lawyer had prepared. He spoke from somewhere deeper. "When my wife and son died," he said quietly, "I told myself I would never open that door again. I built a life where no one could hurt me, where I could keep everything under control. Then Sophie appeared, and suddenly control didn't matter anymore. She reminded me what it means to care about something without expecting anything in return. I can't explain it better than that. But I know what she needs. She needs someone who won't leave." He looked at the judge, his blue eyes steady. "And I won't." The judge sat back in her chair, silent for what felt like forever. Finally, she spoke. "This court recognizes the extraordinary nature of this case. Mr. Hunter, your devotion is evident, but we must ensure the child's long-term welfare. I am granting provisional custody for 60 days under observation. A final ruling will follow based on continued evaluation." It took Alex a moment to understand what she had said. Then relief hit him like a wave. It wasn't permanent, not yet, but it was hope. He turned to Sophie, who was watching anxiously, and gave her a small nod. Her face lit up, and she ran to him, ignoring the startled looks from the officials. She threw her arms around him and whispered, "I knew you'd win." As they left the courthouse, he realized for the first time in years that his chest didn't ache. The fight wasn't over. He knew there would be more hearings, more scrutiny, more questions, but for now, she was coming home. And that was enough. The city outside looked different as they drove away. The snow had stopped, and the clouds were breaking, thin sunlight spilling through like a promise. Sophie sat beside him in the back seat, holding his hand, humming softly under her breath. He glanced at her and thought that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as broken as he had believed. The next 60 days became a slow, quiet miracle, the kind that crept up on Alex without warning. For the first time in years, his house felt like a place where life happened instead of where memories went to die. Sophie filled it with laughter, noise, and warmth that no amount of wealth had ever been able to buy. Every morning she ran down the grand staircase in her socks, calling his name, and every night she fell asleep curled up with her teddy bear and one of the bedtime stories he had started reading again, something he hadn't done since his own son was alive. The once sterile mansion now smelled faintly of crayons, pancakes, and childhood. The staff, who had long treated the house as a workplace, now lingered after hours just to hear Sophie tell stories about the castle she lived in. Even Alex's assistant admitted one afternoon that he had never seen his boss look this alive. But beneath the surface, there was still fear. He knew every day that passed brought them closer to the final hearing, the one that would decide everything. He tried not to let it show, but Sophie could sense it in the way he sometimes stared too long out the window or the way his voice tightened when he said goodnight. One evening, a storm rolled over the city, wind howling through the tall glass windows of the mansion. The power flickered, and the lights went out. Sophie gasped but didn't cry. Instead, she reached for his hand in the dark. "It's okay," he said softly, pulling her close. "It's just thunder." She nodded, pressing her face against his shoulder. "I used to hate storms," she whispered. "Mom would sing to me so I wouldn't be scared." Her words cut deep, but before he could reply, she began to hum softly, her voice trembling at first and then steadying. It was a lullaby, simple and haunting. He closed his eyes, holding her tighter, realizing that for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the storm either. When the lights came back, she was asleep, her head resting on his arm, and he sat there for a long time, watching the firelight dance across her hair, thinking that this fragile piece, was worth everything he had to lose. The final hearing came on a cold morning in early spring. Alex woke before dawn, too restless to eat or even drink his usual coffee. Sophie was already up, dressed in a pale blue dress she had chosen herself. "It's my lucky color," she said with a smile that nearly broke him. They drove in silence, her small hand gripping his the entire way. When they arrived, the courthouse seemed both familiar and terrifying. Inside, the same faces awaited them: the judge, the social worker, the guardian ad litem, and Dr. Williams. But this time, Alex wasn't alone. Sophie was allowed to sit beside him. She swung her legs nervously under the table, holding her bear tightly. The judge began by summarizing the case, speaking in the calm, careful tone of someone who understood that words could shatter lives. Karen Myers spoke first, her voice steadier than before. "Your Honor, since the court granted provisional custody, I have conducted multiple visits and interviews. What I have observed is a bond between Mr. Hunter and the child that cannot be manufactured. It is stable, nurturing, and, frankly, remarkable. Sophie has shown significant emotional improvement and refers to Mr. Hunter as her father." She paused, glancing briefly at Alex, then at Sophie, who was drawing quietly on a piece of paper. "I have no objection to granting full guardianship." The judge nodded, turning to Dr. Williams, who smiled faintly. "I concur," she said. "The attachment is healthy and secure. Removing her now would cause irreversible harm." When the judge finally addressed Alex, he stood, hands slightly trembling but his voice clear. "Your Honor, I don't know what the right words are for something like this," he began. "I've spent my whole life trying to build things, buildings, businesses, walls around myself so nothing could hurt me again.